On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba.
After leading a successful revolt against General Fulgencio Batista.
In October 1959, the U.S. began setting up 15 nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles along Turkey's border with the Soviet Union.
A few days later, the Soviet Premier Khrushchev recommended the deployment of similar Soviet missiles in Cuba.
But Castro didn't want the missiles on his island.
The U.S. tried and failed to kill Castro. We tried and failed to invade Castro's island at the Bay of Pigs. By early 1961, we cut off all trade and diplomatic relations with Castro.
Castro felt the U.S. would try to strike again on his island, so he agreed to let Khrushchev place missiles on the island.
We probably should have known something bad was at hand on October 8, 1962, when Cuban President Dordikis told the General Assembly of the UN, "If we, Cuba, are attacked, we will defend ourselves. I repeat, we have sufficient means with which to defend ourselves. We have indeed our inevitable weapons, the weapons which we would have preferred not to acquire and which we do not wish to employ."
On October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane captured pictures of the construction of nuclear missiles. Early the next day, President John F. Kennedy received the news of the construction of missiles. Kennedy immediately organized ExComm, a group of his 12 most important advisors to handle the crisis.
After 7 days of intense debate with the upper echelons of government, Kennedy decided to create a naval quarantine around Cuba.
He wished to stop any shipment of weapons to the island. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced the discovery of the missile's construction to the public and his decision to create a quarantine around the island.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
During the crisis, tensions began to build on both sides. Kennedy eventually ordered low-level recon missions once every 2 hours.
On the 25th, Kennedy pulled the quarantine line back and raised military readiness to DEFCON 2.
The U.S. received a letter from the Soviets proposing the removal of the missiles and personnel as long as the U.S. would guarantee not to invade Cuba.
October 27th was the worst day of the crisis. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and the ExComm received a second letter from Khrushchev demanding the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles in Cuba.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy suggested ignoring the second letter and contacted Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to tell him of the U.S. agreement with the first letter.
Tensions finally began to ease on October 28th when Khrushchev announced that he would dismantle the missiles and return them to the Soviet Union, expressing his trust that the United States would not invade Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war.